When she invited me to dinner, I told myself it was just business. A simple gesture. A professional thank you for pulling off the impossible on our latest project. That's what she'd said, anyway. But as I stood in front of her apartment door, clutching a bottle of wine in one hand, I couldn't convince myself to believe it. The hallway was quiet, save for the muffled sound of a distant television. I adjusted my grip on the wine, my palms slick with nerves. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat reverberating in my ears as I stared at the polished wooden door in front of me. Ms. Carter. No, Evelyn. Even in my head, her name felt strange and intimate, a break in the boundary I'd worked so hard to maintain. Evelyn Carter was the kind of woman who commanded attention just by existing. Sharp, confident, and always perfectly composed, she walked into a room and shifted the air. Conversations quieted. Heads turned. She carried herself with a quiet power that made people stop and listen. I had spent months trying to stay professional, trying to ignore the way her gaze lingered on me just a second too long in meetings, or the way her voice softened when she asked me a question during late-night deadlines. I'd told myself it was nothing, just her natural charisma. But now, standing outside her apartment, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd been lying to myself. My pulse quickened as I reached up to knock. The sound echoed faintly in the stillness, and I held my breath as I waited. The door opened, and there she was. My breath hitched, my carefully constructed calm unraveling in an instant. Evelyn stood barefoot, the soft light from her apartment casting a warm glow around her. She wore a simple black dress, one that hugged her curves in a way that seemed effortless, and her auburn hair fell loose around her shoulders. She looked nothing like the polished, no-nonsense boss I saw every day. She looked different. Softer. "You made it," she said, her voice warm and inviting. Her smile was small but genuine, and it sent a rush of heat straight to my chest. I managed a smile of my own, though it felt shaky at best. "I wouldn't miss it," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I expected. She stepped back, gesturing for me to come inside. As I crossed the threshold, the subtle scent of lavender and something faintly citrus greeted me, a comforting contrast to the sharp sterility of our office. The space felt personal, intimate, the kind of place someone called home. I handed her the bottle of wine, feeling the brush of her fingers against mine as she took it. The contact was brief, fleeting, but it sent a small jolt through me nonetheless. "This is thoughtful," she said, examining the label. "Thank you. Let me put this in the kitchen." I nodded, unable to do much more than follow her with my eyes as she disappeared down a hallway. The apartment was cozy, warm lighting casting soft shadows across plush furniture and carefully curated art on the walls. It was nothing like I'd imagined, less sleek and modern, more inviting. I moved toward the couch but stopped myself before sitting, unsure if it was appropriate. My nerves had tightened into a knot in my stomach, anticipation and uncertainty tangling together in a way that made it hard to think clearly. When Evelyn returned, she wasn't carrying the wine but instead held 2 glasses, the deep red liquid swirling gently as she handed me one. "Make yourself comfortable," she said, nodding toward the couch. "Thanks," I murmured, sitting down gingerly, careful not to sink too far into the soft cushions. She sat beside me, a comfortable distance, but close enough that I was hyper-aware of every movement, every shift in the air between us. I took a sip of the wine, letting the rich flavor distract me for a moment, but my eyes kept drifting back to her. "This is nice," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quieter now, less formal. Not having to rush, not staring at a spreadsheet for hours. I let out a small laugh, my nerves easing just a fraction. "Yeah, it's different." She smiled at that, a soft curve of her lips that felt more personal than anything I'd seen from her before. "I meant it, you know," she said after a moment. "Inviting you here tonight. You've been incredible these past few months. I don't know what I would have done without you." Her words were kind, her tone genuine, but there was something else in her eyes, something I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, yes, but also something deeper. "I was just doing my job," I said, trying to deflect, but the way she looked at me made the words feel inadequate. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze never wavering. "You do more than your job," she said softly. "You make everything better." The compliment hit me harder than it should have, and I felt a blush creep up my neck. I broke eye contact, taking another sip of wine to steady myself. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was charged, heavy with something unspoken. I could feel her eyes on me, and it took everything in me not to look back. "Dinner should be ready soon," she said after a moment, her voice lighter now, breaking the tension. I nodded, my chest still tight as she stood and walked toward the kitchen, leaving me alone with my thoughts. As I watched her disappear around the corner, I couldn't help but feel like I'd crossed a line just by being here. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. Her apartment was nothing like I expected. Stepping inside felt like entering a different world, one that Evelyn had carefully crafted to feel warm and inviting. The soft lighting cast a golden glow over the cozy furniture, and the faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, subtle but soothing. It was such a contrast to the sharp, sterile environment of the office where I saw her every day. This space felt personal, intimate, like a part of her life she didn't share with just anyone. "Make yourself comfortable," she said, her voice lighter, almost casual, as she handed me a glass of wine. The stem of the glass felt cool against my fingers, but the warmth in her tone settled over me like a blanket. Before I could think of how to respond, she disappeared into the kitchen, leaving me standing there with my thoughts swirling in every direction. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm of nerves and curiosity that had been building since I arrived. I moved toward the couch, pausing for a moment before sitting down. The cushions were soft, sinking slightly under my weight, and I felt the tension in my shoulders ease, just a little. My eyes wandered around the room, taking in the little details. A stack of books on the coffee table, their spines creased and well-loved. A framed photo on the shelf of what looked like Evelyn and a group of friends, laughing on a sunlit patio. A small, potted plant on the windowsill, its leaves glossy and green. This wasn't the Evelyn Carter I knew at work. There, she was all clean lines and precision, her office a minimalist haven where every object had a purpose. Here, there were imperfections, coziness. It was disarming. I heard the faint clatter of plates from the kitchen, and my heart skipped a beat. There was something surreal about being here, in her home, surrounded by her world. The woman I'd always seen as untouchable now felt achingly human, and I didn't know what to do with that realization. When she returned, the sight of her stopped my thoughts in their tracks. She carried 2 plates, each one balanced with a perfect serving of pasta and garlic bread. There was something about the way she moved, confident, sure of herself, but not rushed. Her black dress swayed softly with each step, and her bare feet made the moment feel impossibly intimate. "I hope you're hungry," she said with a small smile, setting the plates down on the coffee table. I nodded, swallowing hard as I set my glass of wine down beside me. "I didn't realize you cooked," I said, my voice softer than I intended. Her smile widened, a flicker of amusement in her eyes. "There's a lot you don't know about me," she said lightly, sitting down beside me. She tucked one leg beneath her, her posture relaxed, as if this was something we did all the time. We started eating, and I was surprised by how good the food was. The pasta was perfectly al dente, the garlic bread crisp and buttery, and I couldn't help but smile between bites. "This is incredible," I said, gesturing toward my plate. She tilted her head, her eyes sparkling. "I'm glad you think so. Cooking's one of the few things that gets me out of my own head." As we ate, the conversation began to flow effortlessly. She asked about my family, something she'd never brought up before. At first, I stumbled over my answers, still caught off guard by how different this Evelyn was from the one I knew. But as the minutes passed, I found myself opening up, talking about my childhood, my siblings, and even the dog I'd begged my parents for when I was 12. She listened intently, her attention never wavering. Every now and then, she'd laugh softly at something I said, and the sound made my chest feel warm and light. When it was her turn to speak, she surprised me again. She told me about growing up in a small town, about the summer she spent working at her family's diner, and how those days had shaped her work ethic. She shared pieces of herself I never expected to hear, and with every story, I felt the image I'd built of her at work shift and expand. The way she looked at me as we talked was almost too much to bear. Her gaze was soft but piercing, like she was seeing straight through me in a way no one else ever had. There was no judgment in her eyes, only genuine interest, and it made my pulse race in a way I couldn't control. When I finished telling her about a particularly embarrassing moment from college, she laughed, the sound filling the room like music. "I never would have guessed that about you," she said, her tone teasing but kind. "What can I say? I'm full of surprises," I replied, smiling despite the nerves still fluttering in my chest. Her smile lingered, and for a moment, the room felt impossibly still. The flicker of candlelight on the table cast shadows across her face, highlighting the curve of her cheek, the slight tilt of her lips. "More than you realize," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words sent a shiver down my spine, and I looked away, suddenly feeling exposed. My fingers fidgeted with the edge of my plate, and I searched for something to say, something to fill the silence. But before I could, she leaned back, picking up her glass of wine with an ease that made me envy her composure. "Tell me about your hobbies," she said, her tone light again. "What do you do when you're not saving the company?" I laughed nervously, grateful for the shift in conversation. "Not much, honestly. I guess I read a lot. And I've been trying to learn how to garden, though I'm terrible at it." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, her lips curving into a playful smile. "Gardening, huh? That's unexpected. I've killed every plant I've touched," I admitted, laughing. "But I'm stubborn, so I keep trying." "Well," she said, raising her glass slightly, "here's to perseverance." Our glasses clinked softly, and I couldn't help but smile. The storm of nerves in my chest had quieted, replaced by something warmer, steadier. But beneath the easy flow of conversation and the wine-fueled laughter, there was an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name. Something that lingered in the way she looked at me, in the soft cadence of her voice when she said my name. And it left me wondering what would happen next. After dinner, the room had taken on a different kind of stillness. The plates were empty, our glasses half full, and the air between us felt heavier somehow, charged with something I couldn't quite name. Evelyn stood and reached for the bottle of wine on the table, her movements fluid and unhurried. "Another glass?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. I nodded, unable to find my voice. She poured with practiced ease, the crimson liquid catching the glow of the candlelight. "Come on," she said, gesturing toward the couch. "Let's get comfortable." I hesitated for only a second before following her lead, taking my glass with me as I moved to the sofa. It felt strange, sitting there beside her, the cushions sinking slightly under our weight. We weren't far apart, close enough that I could feel the faint warmth of her presence, close enough that every movement felt deliberate. That's when things shifted. Evelyn took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes on me over the rim of her glass. There was something in her gaze, something quiet but intense, and it made my heart stutter in my chest. "I have to admit," she said finally, her voice lower now, richer. The sound of it sent a shiver down my spine. My fingers tightened slightly around the stem of my glass. "Admit what?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. She leaned back against the couch, her posture relaxed, but her eyes never left mine. "I didn't just invite you here to thank you for your hard work," she said, the corners of her lips curving into the faintest smile. Her words hit me like a shockwave, stealing the air from my lungs. "Oh," I managed, my voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn set her glass down on the coffee table, the sound of it meeting the wood startling in the quiet room. Then she turned to face me fully, her body angled toward mine, her expression unreadable but intense. "You've been driving me crazy," she confessed, the words slipping from her lips like a secret she'd been holding too tightly for too long. My heart stopped, then started again in a frantic rhythm. "What?" She leaned in slightly, her eyes locked on mine, her voice both vulnerable and teasing as she continued. "The way you smile, the way you speak up in meetings. It's been impossible to ignore." Her words hung in the air, heavy and electric, and I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying, trying to decide if this was real or some vivid dream. I started, but the words caught in my throat. Evelyn tilted her head, a slow, knowing smile spreading across her face. The way she looked at me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever seen before, soft and piercing all at once, as if she could see every thought, every feeling I was too afraid to voice. Her hand moved then, brushing lightly against mine, and the contact sent a spark racing through me. It was the smallest touch, so faint it could have been accidental, but it wasn't. The heat rushed through me, my skin burning where her fingers lingered. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at her as the space between us seemed to shrink. "Evelyn, I tried again, but my voice betrayed me, trembling under the weight of her gaze. She silenced me with a look, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Desire, maybe. Or something deeper, more dangerous. "You don't have to say anything," she said softly, her voice like a lullaby, soothing and impossible to resist. "I just needed you to know." Her words left me breathless, the confession settling over me like a weight I didn't know how to carry. The rational part of me screamed that this was wrong, that I should say something, do something to stop whatever was happening. But that part of me was drowned out by the way her lips curved, by the way her hand lingered just close enough to mine to drive me mad. The world outside her apartment seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of us and the storm of emotions swirling between us. I didn't know what to say, what to do, and as she leaned back slightly, giving me just enough space to breathe, I realized I wasn't sure I wanted to. The tension between us reached a boiling point, the air thick with everything we weren't saying but couldn't ignore. My pulse roared in my ears, every nerve in my body screaming at me to move, to do something, but I couldn't. I was frozen under the weight of her gaze, my mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Evelyn leaned closer, her movements deliberate, her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made it impossible to breathe. My heart pounded, each beat echoing in the silence of the room. When her lips finally brushed against mine, soft and tentative, the world seemed to tilt, everything else falling away. The kiss unraveled me. It was slow, deliberate, as if she was giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Every carefully constructed defense I'd built around myself shattered in that moment. Her lips were warm and soft, her touch gentle but insistent, and it felt like I was free-falling into something I couldn't control. Her hands moved to my face, her fingers brushing my skin with a tenderness that made my chest ache. The scent of her perfume, subtle and floral, enveloped me, and I felt like I was drowning in her presence. Every inch of space between us vanished, and I gave in completely, my own hands moving without thought, gripping her waist like it was the only thing keeping me grounded. Time slowed. Each moment stretched into eternity, and I couldn't tell if seconds or hours had passed. All I knew was her lips, her touch, the way her breath hitched slightly when I deepened the kiss. When we finally pulled apart, my chest heaved as I tried to catch my breath. Her forehead rested against mine, her eyes closed, her breath warm against my lips. "I've been waiting for the right moment," she admitted, her voice trembling slightly, barely above a whisper. I opened my eyes, staring at her, and for the first time, I didn't see the polished, untouchable woman who commanded every room she entered. I saw Evelyn, raw, vulnerable, and impossibly human. Her confession sent a ripple through me, and I wasn't sure if it was fear, exhilaration, or both. "This changes everything," I whispered, my voice shaking as the weight of what had just happened began to sink in. "It does," she agreed, pulling back just enough to meet my gaze. Her green eyes were soft, searching, and for a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of uncertainty there, as if she wasn't sure what I'd do next. Her words hung between us, fragile and undeniable. "But maybe it's worth it." I didn't know what to say. My mind was a storm of emotions, desire, confusion, fear, and something else I couldn't name. This wasn't just a line we'd crossed. It was a chasm, one that couldn't be undone. We sat there for what felt like hours, the silence between us heavy, but not uncomfortable. Her hand lingered on mine, her thumb brushing small, absent circles against my skin, grounding me in the moment. Eventually, she leaned back, breaking the spell. Her expression had shifted slightly, her professional mask creeping back into place, but there was still a softness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "You should go," she said quietly, her tone gentle but firm. I nodded, the words catching in my throat. I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to lose the warmth of her presence, the quiet intimacy we'd just shared. But I knew she was right. Staying any longer would only complicate things further. As I stood, my legs felt unsteady, my heart still racing as if trying to catch up with what had just happened. Evelyn walked me to the door, the faint scent of lavender following us like a ghost. When we reached the threshold, she hesitated, her hand lingering on the doorknob. "I don't regret this," she said softly, her eyes searching mine. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Neither do I admitted, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. A small, almost sad smile tugged at her lips, and for a moment, I thought she might kiss me again. But instead, she opened the door, the cool air from the hallway rushing in and breaking the bubble we'd been in. "Good night," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. "Good night," I replied, stepping out into the hallway. The door closed softly behind me, and I stood there for a moment, staring at the wood grain, trying to steady my breathing. The silence of the hallway was deafening compared to the charged energy I'd just left behind. As I walked away, my mind was a whirlwind. Every step felt surreal, my thoughts tangled in a mess of emotions, desire, confusion, and a dangerous sense of hope that I couldn't ignore. Evelyn had flipped my world upside down, and I knew there was no going back to the way things were. I didn't know what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Nothing about my life, about us, would ever be the same again.